Today, we're going to talk about the big elephant in the room, the skepticism that comes with a new world record set in the women's marathon distance. Today, we're going to talk about doping. Hey runners, my name is Letty and I create running content. I'm also the host of the weekly marathon running podcast, available on all platforms. And I want to start this video with a disclaimer. In no way, shape, or form am I insinuating with this video or anything else I'm providing that Ruth Chepngetich is doping. She is the new world record holder of the marathon distance until somebody else makes the decision that she is not. Rather, I'm making this video because there is skepticism that rises when a world record is broken, which in this case happened on October 13th of 2024 when Ruth Chepngetich crossed the finish line at the Chicago Marathon in 2 hours, 9 minutes, and 56 seconds. With the performance, she smashed the previously set world record set in 2023 by Tigist Assefa, who came in almost 2 minutes slower at 2 hours, 11 minutes, and 53 seconds. And I remember last year when Tigist Assefa broke the world record, it was also jaw-dropping because she had almost broken it by 2 minutes too. The previous world record before that had belonged to Hassan Sifan, who had come in 2 hours, 13 minutes, and 44 seconds. So as you can see, these world records are being broken by almost 2 minutes at a time. We're not talking 10, 20 seconds here. So obviously skepticism is running high, especially given that Ruth's agent is Federico Rosa, an Italian agent who has previously been under the microscope as he had athletes disqualified under him. Two of the athletes disqualified under him were Rita Yeptu and Asbel Kiprop. Federico Rosa, however, was never convicted of anything. His agency, however, points the fingers at the doctors in Kenya, and I quote, "because of unscrupulous Kenyan doctors who approached the athletes, brainwashing and subjecting them to illegal treatments." Now, since I am super into the sport of marathon running and I host the Marathon Running Podcast, I approached the USADA, US Anti-Doping Agency, and was granted an interview with Dr. Laura Lewis, who was able to answer a lot of my questions that I had when it came to doping, which by definition is the use of prohibited substances or methods or techniques which serve to enhance performance. To start with, we talked about the methods that marathoners use to dope.
A lot of the practices that we might hear about in the context of marathon running are particularly around blood doping. And so that's increasing the red blood cells and the amount of hemoglobin in those red blood cells that carry oxygen around your body, enabling you to perform at a high level. You'd both be more efficient when you are running, but also able to run faster. And ways that athletes might blood dope would be either taking an erythropoietic stimulating agents. And I know that sounds quite a lot of complicated words there, but that just basically means stimulating your body to produce more red blood cells. And the most famous erythropoietic stimulating agent that we know of is erythropoietin, or EPO. So injecting EPO can stimulate your body to produce these red blood cells in a more accelerated time frame. The other way that you could increase the number of red blood cells you have is to infuse a bag of blood, and that could either be from your own body that you'd taken out several weeks or months earlier, or by using somebody else's blood that they've donated to you. So all of those practices, the erythropoietic stimulating agents, or the infusions of blood, they are all prohibited in sport and considered doping.
Now, WADA, the World Anti-Doping Agency, publishes a list every single year about the substances that are prohibited when it comes to the sport of running. All athletes participating in these events are subject to that list. However, there is something called a gray zone.
In sport, there's a process known as a therapeutic use exemption, and that allows an athlete to take a normally prohibited substance to treat a medical condition. And there's a pretty strict process for applying for a TUE, and you have to provide medical justifications and really make sure that the athlete legitimately needs that medication. But of course, if they do, we don't want to disadvantage them. But there might be some athletes that are trying to game the situation for some of those in terms of a TUE and trying to use something that they might not 100% need from a medical standpoint. But on the whole, those athletes are few and far between, and the TUE process is quite rigorous, that often they won't be granted a TUE if it can't be shown that they actually really need one. Where the grey zone may come into play is that science is always making advances, and so there are substances that may not yet be listed because they might be quite new, and we don't know the full extent of their power, I guess, in sport, and so they might not be on the list explicitly, and some athletes might be experimenting with those substances or methods, and technically, if it's not on the prohibited list, then they're not doing anything wrong. But is it really in the spirit of sport, particularly if 2 years down the track the substance then becomes on the prohibited list?
And this gray zone is probably where most of the skepticism comes from. It's probably much harder to find an athlete that has no medical condition that does show some sort of substance in his blood versus having an athlete that already has a medical condition that now shows a little bit higher finding of a substance that is prohibited. And with that comes the question, who are those doctors and how legit is that process? Now, a lot of you may already know how doping is done in marathoning, but she explained it to us.
Ultimately, at those big events, World Athletics has the jurisdiction, and they are responsible for managing any results that come out of those events. But in terms of who collects them, for the major marathons in the US, USADA is usually the sample collection authority. So we were just at the Chicago Marathon. We were at Boston earlier in the year, and we'll be in New York coming up. And so we are contracted to provide a gold standard service. So we are responsible for ensuring that the samples are collected, to the highest standards, with integrity and in accordance with the World Anti-Doping Code and the rules associated with that. And then we will ship the samples to a WADA accredited laboratory. We have 2 in the US that we can choose from. But then the results of those are provided back to World Athletics, who have their own anti-doping unit, independent anti-doping unit called the Athletics Integrity Unit, and they will handle the results of that. So it can be a little bit confusing for athletes, particularly the US athletes who might be part of our registered testing pool. They might see the doping control officer one day at their house, and they are there collecting on behalf of USADA, and then they'll see them at the marathon, and now they're collecting on behalf of World Athletics. Usually in these third world countries, they will often have a national anti-doping agency, but they will have limited resources. So they're really looking to World Athletics and the Athletics Integrity Unit to go out there and test on their behalf. So I think, not wanting to speak on behalf of the AIU, but they do a lot of testing in East Africa, to help out the situation over there. And they would follow the same rules as the rest of the world. So if an athlete is part of the registered testing pool, and then they're required to provide whereabouts. If they're not where they say they are, then the AIU will investigate and decide whether there is a consequence of missing that test. And if you miss 3 tests in a rolling 12-month period, then you can be sanctioned and have to miss out on future competitions for a period of time.
Now, since we're talking about certain substances being found in the blood and values being high, let's talk about the baseline, where that baseline comes from, and the ABP, which is the athlete's biological passport.
The athlete's biological passport, or the ABP, but that's a way of indirectly detecting blood doping. And what it involves is collecting a series of blood tests from an athlete over the length of their career, and looking for changes in their patterns. The ABP uses a mathematical model to predict what the normal range would be for that athlete. So it allows for upper, fluctuations up or down in certain parameters. As quite rightly you said, if you went to altitude, and your body might naturally increase. So those are taken into account. But if there's a sudden change up or down, which creates known patterns that are associated with blood doping, this kind of raises a red flag. And, we will look into that, and a group of independent experts will look into that to see if there is a normal explanation. Then athletes can actually be sanctioned.
Now, since a lot of these world records are being broken at the world major marathons organized by Abbott, let's talk a little bit about what Abbott is doing in order to prevent this. Abbott has created the world's biggest privately funded anti-doping program, with more tests, and these tests are in addition to the IAAF, or National Federation tests. Abbott ensures that the prize money won for these marathons is paid out over 5 years, not all at once. And Abbott also ensures that no athlete that has been found guilty previously is able to participate in their events. What is also interesting is that samples are retained for 10 years, enabling an athlete to be found guilty retroactively if there's a new method of detecting a substance that was illegal at the time of their performance. However, if the athlete took a substance that was not illegal at the time of their performance and that substance is found afterwards, obviously they cannot be guilty of having used something that was not on the list. Now, where does all of this leave us, people that watch the marathon, that love the distance, that follow the sport? It leaves us to being able to build our own opinion. Obviously, there are a lot of factors in the running world now that we did not have before. Women are now training like guys with guys. I know that Ruth is self-coached and she runs with the guys. We also have carbon-plated shoes. We have nutrition that has been optimized for each runner. So there are a lot of different things that have happened in the sport that have developed it. And we've seen even the average runners in the United States, in the world, getting faster. The Boston standards are getting tighter. Chicago has tightened their standards just because of more people doing better and running faster. I want to believe in the best in people, so that's where it leaves me. You're obviously entitled to your own opinion. The court of public opinion is actively out there. You can find so many different opinions on all of that. Personally, I would be heartbroken if there was another person found guilty of engaging in illegal activities when it comes to running the sport that I've learned to love so much. Mainly because of the runners-up, because the limelight would have been stolen from them. So that's all I got. Stay tuned for future videos. If this video was of any value to you, consider subscribing. And until next time.